we have tracking data on 29 body parts 60 times a second.
On January 22nd, 2024, Joel Embiid was at the peak of his powers. That night, he took on a San Antonio Spurs team for the first time, featuring Victor Wembanyama, and Joel Embiid gave him the business. 70 points in the game. He was scoring a point a minute that season. He sent the San Antonio Spurs to what would be their 35th defeat in 43 games so far that year. Lo, how much has changed since then, as Victor Wembanyama now leads the second seed in the Western Conference, the San Antonio Spurs. Joel Embiid has struggled with injuries the last 2 years, but he is finally healthy again. And you know Victor Wembanyama has remembered every one of those 70 points the last 2 years, and he is going to show Joel Embiid tonight everything that he has learned. Welcome on to the NBA Strategy Stream. I'm Nate Duncan, joined by my usual partner, Danny Leroux, Charlie Rohlf, the VP of NBA Stats and Technology. We are going to take you deeper inside every possession here on the NBA Strategy Stream. And let's begin by talking about all these great new stats that the NBA Strategy Stream, powered by AWS, can rely on tonight. Charlie, let's begin with an explanation of the AWS gravity stat.
Thanks for having me today, guys. Excited to start with gravity here, and we'll feature Victor Wembanyama as we illustrate the power of this new gravity stat through inside the game in AWS. So in a nutshell, gravity measures the amount of attention any offensive player gets from the defense. And we built a model. We looked at the position of all 5 offensive players with no defenders and looked at thousands and thousands of possessions. And we can come up with a baseline. And then if a player gets more attention or more pressure from his opponents, then we would expect that player has higher gravity. And the opposite is true too. If they get lower pressure, they're being left unguarded on the perimeter, they get lower gravity. And Victor Wembanyama, one of the highest gravities in the league. And when you pair that with our pose tracking data, it really shows how incredible a weapon he is as an offensive player. Of course, he's top 10 in the league, both on-ball gravity and off-ball gravity on the interior, right? He's an incredible lob threat, great in the post, as we're seeing here on these highlights. But it's on the perimeter that's really surprising. He's top 20 in off-ball perimeter gravity. And really that list is all primary offensive superstars and great three-point shooters, and then Wemby. And his off-ball gravity on the perimeter is what really opens up for the Spurs. And it's obviously because he's such a great shooter, but also his size. He's so big, and you hear about that on the defensive end, but if you want to alter his shot, you have to do it on the gather, and you can't leave him because you gotta, if he goes up and gets into a shot, he's unblockable. And with our pose tracking data, we have found that his average release height on three-pointers is 9 feet 9 inches.
Wow.
That is insanely high. If you compare that to someone like Joel Embiid, it's much lower. Victor, you just cannot block his shot. Danny, Joel Embiid has a unique skill set, and that's illustrated by the AWS shot difficulty metric.
Joel Embiid has the second highest shot difficulty for any center in the league. The only one higher is Miles Turner, and that is also explained by where his shots occur. A lot of them are away from the basket, and those are typically more difficult shots because they're not a dunk or anything like that. And so Joel Embiid, particularly as he's aged and becoming more confident jump shooter, he's taking tougher shots, but he's converting them. He has a very high per shot making percentage over what is expected.
Yeah, Charlie, take us through how it is that shot difficulty is measured exactly, as we're seeing some of these difficult turnarounds and fadeaways that the big man is able to put in.
I mentioned it with Wembanyama and gravity, but we have tracking data on 29 body parts 60 times a second over the course of the game. And we measure that pose of the player, and we can build models, AI models, that look at every shot and the position of the offensive player. Did they have to turn around and come off a screen or come out of the post and do a turnaround fadeaway like we're seeing here from Embiid? Where's the defender's hand on the shot attempt? How close was the defender to guarding or blocking the shot? We put all those into a model, and we come up with the expected field goal percentage for an average NBA shooter in the exact same scenario. And then we can see that players, great offensive players like Embiid, exceed that expected offensive field goal percentage by a pretty significant margin.
Yeah, and Embiid is absolutely impossible to stop for that reason. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the defensive matchup stat. And before we get Charlie to explain that to us, I think there are some fascinating matchups in tonight's game. You can start with Tyrese Maxey and Stephon Castle, one of the best on-ball defenders. And then also you see him here going at Wembanyama as well. And so how many seconds is Stephon Castle going to guard Maxey? Are they going to be able to manipulate the matchups? And then who's going to guard Joel Embiid? Is that going to be Wembanyama? Is he going to switch on to Maxey when Maxey and Embiid interact? And then what about the other end too? A lot of teams like to put a power forward on Wembanyama. Well, where does that leave Embiid exactly? Because the Spurs have done such a great job putting Champagne in the starting lineup, there isn't really anywhere for Embiid to hide. So Charlie, take us through exactly how that matchup is calculated.
Simply put, we taught the computer the basics of man-to-man defensive basketball. And coming out of that, we get the pressure of how much pressure each defensive player is exerting on each offensive player. That's the basis for the gravity metric. But we can also run an optimization algorithm and figure out who the primary matchups are for every frame of the game, every 60th of a second. Who's primarily responsible for whom, which defender is responsible for each offensive player. And from there, we can add it up over the course of the game. We figure out each stat that occurred and the matchup that took place when that stat took place.
Yeah, and so if someone starts guarding someone, they switch throughout the possession, and you're able to log that and see who the shot was actually taken against. Now, we'll take you through exactly how to use these stats, right? A lot of times, big men might have the shot eventually taken to them. That's not necessarily their fault because perhaps someone on the perimeter is blown by. They weren't even in the frame to get the stat assigned to them when the shot is actually taken. And so certainly these are great stats, but also you can look at it tells a story that more than just, hey, it was this guy's fault defensively. You can look at what the scheme was, what the initial matchups were a lot of times. And then I think when, let's say, a guy has a lot of matchup time against one player, but most of the shots are being taken against his teammates, that shows you some of the strategy that they're really trying to get that player off of him so he could take the shot. So it's a fascinating tool to use and really tells so many stories about the game. So another one of the AWS stats that we can look at is leverage. That will show you what effect players are having on the game. It quantifies the highest impact players and moments in the game. We'll talk more about that, what's going on in the first quarter with Charlie.